lovely to be here in Wales this evening, and I have in fact been to Wales to interview hibakusha, who one of the few known in this country who lives not a million miles away, and he's a very wonderful and generous lady who gave me at least an hour and a half of her time. So that's the last time I went to Wales, actually. Was on the same task. So I'm just going to introduce where I'm coming from, how I started the research, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about issues about oral history, so issues about silencing and untold stories, and how I feel my research fits into sort of current framework of thinking about Hiroshima. And then I'm going to show a short film of one of the hibakusha themselves. So my own interest in this subject, I suppose, started sort of before my formative years, when I remember a sibling of mine rather kind of almost hostilely told me that there was a bomb that could destroy the world, and I didn't really think anything of it at the time. But later on, when I started to work in Japan, I was doing an internship with a foreign language newspaper there called the Japan Times. Obviously it was of interest again, and I then went from that job into working for an international magazine that was focused especially on peace building and so on, and at one point they did a magazine which featured the stories of hibakusha. So that was my first direct encounter with them, and I was very moved by the stories, but I didn't think of doing much about it until I was then commissioned to write a travel book on Japan, and went to did a one-night stopover in Hiroshima. And before I went there, I was speaking to a friend of mine who had a 7-year-old son who was saying to her, what is a nuclear weapon? What is it about? And so I felt sort of motivated in a way to sort of find out more. And I discovered that one of the jokes about Hiroshima is that you, as a foreign visitor, you get into a taxi at the station and you say with some trepidation, "Oh, how are things in Hiroshima?" And the taxi driver says to you, "Well, the cars aren't doing very well now." And you go, "What?" You think, you have prejudices about radiation and so on, images of clouds in your head, and the taxi driver says, "No, the car as in the Hiroshima baseball team," which this was are not doing very well. And in fact, Hiroshima has one of the most famous and most successful baseball teams in Japan, and it is well known around the world. So anyway, the next day I was due to go to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, and the taxi driver was asking me what I was doing, and he said, "Oh, do you know why the CARP baseball team is called the CARP baseball team?" And I said, "No," and he said, "It's because of the castle." So Hiroshima Castle is known as is much celebrated because the carp around the moat were kept by the local Lord Asano, and they were at one point the Asano Han, as they were known, the lord of the castle, gave out the carp and also his rice supplies as food for his famished population in the 17th century. So ever since then, the carp have been the local symbol. And so when I went down the next day to that area, because in fact that was the target of the atomic bomb, the atomic bomb was targeted at the most populated area downtown called Nakajima, and the castle is located there, as well as a very, very built-up area of the city, and that's now where the Memorial Museum is, if any of you have the chance to go. Had a quick tour of the museum, and as usual, was very moved by the exhibits, as most visitors are, and was taken to a cafe where I was offered local food, which is called okonomiyaki, which means eat what you like. It's a kind of wartime food in a way. And my host started talking to the cafe owner and said, "Do you remember the atomic bomb?" The 70-year-old man. And the cafe owner said, yes, of course I do. He said, I was evacuated, I was 40 kilometres away, but I remember the pica and the don. So pica don is the way that the atomic bomb is known in Hiroshima, because the word genbaku, atomic bomb, was censored in 1945. So that generation, the older generation, will still talk about the atomic bomb as a picadon, which means a pica, a flash, and a don, a boom. So it's known as a flash boom, unlike any other experience of an explosion thus far. So I then talked to my hosts, and my hosts, it turned out, were both children of hibakusha, and they told me that their parents had passed away without telling them the stories of their experience, really. And then they told me that that was the norm, that in fact it was quite usual in here. It was more usual in Hiroshima for people to die without talking about their experiences. So that's when I linked two aspects of the research together. I realised that there was a generation growing up here, ignorant really of the effects of nuclear weapons, and there was a generation in Japan dying out who had not told their stories. But this obviously was something that needed a lot more work, and I didn't really pursue it until a friend of mine said to me, who researched genocides, and she said, you have to interview, if you want to do this, you have to interview people more than once. You have to, in order to get their life stories, you need to spend more than, you have to do more than just a single interview. That's when and also the sensitivity of the survivors obviously means that they're rather hard to access, and journalists have written about this in the past. So I was very privileged then to get a grant to go out and interview hibakusha between 2012 and 2014. I interviewed 25 hibakusha, and 8 of these interviews I selected as life histories, which I have now worked into I have now put into a PhD in, which is cross-disciplinary between English, psychology and applied linguistics. So the sensitivity of the survivors is obviously something that is very particular, and that means that the input of the psychology department is quite important in that aspect of my research. So the average age of hibakusha in Japan is now about 80 years old, and in 5 years' time, it's likely that most of the people who really clearly remember the event will have passed away. So there is this urgency at the moment, and especially in the light of the 70th anniversary, there's a lot of discussion about the way in which Hiroshima should be remembered, both in Japan and abroad, in the States especially. I felt that I had to hurry up. This was research that had to be done within a particular time frame. And I did a pilot research project. I went to Notting Hill and I interviewed survivors of the Blitz in London in order to select a group, in order to find a framework in which to select interviewees. And in that process, I realised that I wanted to use a model of resilience theory, which is an emergent field in psychology and also in other social sciences. And it's been described by someone who, a co-researcher in Hiroshima, as the attitude of a positive adjustment in the face of adversity. And so I found that through using resilience and also the field of narrative studies and oral history, I've been able to look at the hibakusha in their what's known as their irreplaceable uniqueness. So their stories as unique narratives which stand up as constructive life histories. And so by developing a relationship with them over time, a sort of dialogue with them, it's been possible to sort of co-author their narratives with them. So my aim is to firmly anchor the project in narrative studies with Japanese studies and psychology, so as to situate these experiences within the context of changing attitudes towards the end of the Second World War. So that's my main aim in my research, is to really look at how these experiences have been viewed in the past and to sort of reposition them as stories in their own right, as texts, as unique texts that have their own meaning and worth at this particular time. So I will just introduce you to a few of the survivors who I interviewed you. So that's my first trip to the museum. So you'll recognise possibly the layout. That's the city of Hiroshima, and that's the relative size of the bomb just before it was detonated. And this map, now I don't know if it will still be there because the museum has been totally redesigned for this year. Actually, it probably won't even be open this year, it will be open next year. But that is a very remarkable map because it shows you the scale of the exposure. So this is one interviewee, Shoso Kawamoto. He was 11 years old at the time of the bomb, and he had an experience which is very rare to have someone who's still alive to remember. He was an orphan. He was what's known as an atomic bomb orphan. He was evacuated from the city, and when he came back to the city, he found his parents and his siblings, not all of them, but only one sibling was left alive. So one sibling looked after him for a while, but then she passed away, and he was left to fend for himself. And so what he remembers is the way that the orphans lived, because there were thousands of orphans who came back to the city after it was bombed, just to discover their families had gone. So that story is a sort of untold story in itself. I remember that on 17th of September there was a big typhoon, and afterwards more and more children who had been offered homes by their relatives and friends after the bomb were forced out and returned to the city. The women only delivered food to the children until November. Thousands were looking for something to eat. By December there was no food, so by the end of the year, thousands of children died of starvation, their bodies burnt with garbage or thrown in the river. The dead children were found with stones in their mouths. They had been so short of food, they gnawed at stones to prevent their stomachs from grumbling. So this is him, and he's looking at, obviously, a map of Hiroshima to rediscover where he was bombed. And we visited actually not where he was bombed, but where his home was that he came back to. And so that's one of them. There's another one is here. So this is a survivor who had then become a teacher, and he had actually moved right out of the city after the bomb. He lived with his relatives in an area which is known to be a sort of Korean area, because Koreans in Hiroshima, in most Japanese cities at the time, lived on the edges of the cities. So his experience is particularly interesting because he worked then with Korean survivors, with hibakusha from Korea, in order to help them, because after the war they had a very particular story of discrimination. So this is him. I remember the house where we lived, an old-style two-story Japanese wooden house with a gable roof and ceramic tiles, which is what they used to have in those days, where we used to pound mochi or rice cakes at New Year. 8 people lived in that house, including my aunt, my uncle who died, my cousins, in fact everyone apart from my grandfather and grandmother. We Japanese discriminated against the Koreans, but because I was a child I had no awareness of why there was discrimination against Koreans, even though I must have been part of it. For the Koreans at the school where I taught, they experienced discrimination, just as I had seen in my school when I was a young boy. There's him, and he has you may see there, he has little medal there, and this is a wooden medal that he was given by the government of Korea for his work on behalf of hibakusha in Korea. This is a memory specifically of the of coming back into the city. This is another child who was evacuated, Yuroi Sato. She was 8 years old at the time of the bomb, and she'd been evacuated with her, and all her family actually had come to visit her, so they all survived. There she is. I don't know how to go back. And she told us about how she had returned to the city and found her house, and this is very moving. We saw a shelter made of 3 sticks, and in front of the shelter, and inside the shelter was a mother, her body burned all over, feeding a child. Whether they were alive or dead, I will never forget the sight of that mother. And there's a sort of urgency when people are talking about these experiences to really convey the most touching, the most important thing, the most touching image that they remember, that they really want to convey to the next generation. So this is a survivor who I'll show a clip of actually, because we interviewed her at an event where she was after an event where she was speaking, and she talked in depth really about the memories of the war in her family. And so she said, I remember when the Pacific War started on December the 8th. I heard over the radio that Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. My cousins and uncles were sent to battle along with all my main relatives. Many didn't return, but my father joined the Akatsuki Butai, the rescue corps, even though he was registered as a priest. He had a certificate as a Buddhist monk before the war. During the wars, he was in the Navy. My uncle said that Japan would be defeated because Japan doesn't know the world. Japan is like a frog in the world, and the military don't know anything. So these kind of stories, here she is, are told by survivors because they feel still, in a way, there's still a sense that censorship that was imposed, the sense of silencing after the war, means that they haven't fully told their stories, and they really want to tell the story of how there was so much resistance and so much anti-war feeling as well among ordinary people, ordinary families, that could never be expressed obviously under the military regime. So here she is, and she's with a classmate who she bumped into, and so she and this classmate are chatting about their memories of this area which was her home back in 1945. So there she is with her family. So that's 3 generations, and her granddaughter here was very key to her story because her granddaughter is actually the one who first published an article about her grandmother, and it's in fact, she's now a student over here in fact. And it was really through her encouragement that this survivor, Emiko Yamanaka, decided to tell her story. And that's just a picture. So this is a streetcar from Hiroshima, which I'm sure Chris will recognise. Some of the streetcars, some of the trams survived. Only, I think, maybe 4, something like that. And they put them up and running again, and they are a sort of very nostalgic feature of Hiroshima. So this is the streetcar to Eba, which is what she was taking when she had to get off the streetcar and walk because there had been an area warning. And there's an area. So I want to talk a bit now about. I could introduce you to many survivors, but I haven't. I would like to, in a way, talk about how these narratives have been, how they've been viewed and how they've been, in a way, marginalized within Japan and also abroad. And so I'd argue that there are 2 basic competing narratives about Hiroshima. One related to the scientific narrative, which is the idea of the bomb as a technological achievement, in the 20th century, and the narrative of the experiences of hibakusha. So I don't know if anyone here knows, that you probably do, the meaning of hibakusha. Why do we use that expression? So it's quite simple, basically, and I'm sure everyone will know. Hibaku is sunbomb and sha is person. So instead of survivor, say zonsha, we only can use this word survivor. The survivors have adopted this word hibakusha, which means the explosion-affected person, because out of respect for the dead. So, so these narratives about Hiroshima are parallel and sometimes contrasting. So whereas the witnesses of the Holocaust in Germany are held as unique bearers of the extremities of human suffering, the narrative of the atomic bomb and its achievement technologically is what still grips us mainly over here in the West. The stories of the hibakusha are still seen as an unwitting byproduct, if you like, of modern science and technology's greatest destructive achievement, an unwanted anomaly in the narrative of the now much disputed saving power of the bomb and the success of the Cold War that followed. And it has taken a long time for survivors of the atomic bombing to feel comfortable to talk about their experiences of that day. It's known simply as anarchy in Japanese. In the immediate aftermath of the bomb, there were many reasons why survivors did not want to dwell on it. Censorship meant that there were few photographs, and in fact there were only 2 newspapers in Japan that managed to print a photograph of the mushroom cloud. The Allied forces attempted to, in a way, shroud the dropping of the bomb in secrecy. So there were soldiers and experts who came to investigate the bomb damage, but there were not doctors or humanitarian workers. There was one Red Cross, the chief of the Red Cross, Dr. Juno, came over personally and requested funds specifically for basic medicines. But by September, when the Americans moved to Japan, on the 19th of September 1945, they issued what is known as a press code. And so that introduced press censorship. And some of the first foreigners, Wilfred Burchett and also George Weller, who writing for the Daily Express and the Chicago Daily News, had not gone to the main handover ceremony, which was on the battleship Missouri. 600 journalists were there. They took themselves to Hiroshima on a train, and Burchett to Hiroshima and Weller to Nagasaki, and reported. And the Daily Express headline at that time was "No More Hiroshimas," which was then very much taken up by the Japanese in Hiroshima. So that gives you an idea about the way that the occupying forces were keen to limit knowledge about the bomb. And there was also a question about photographs. Why aren't there more photographs at the time? The US bombing survey team conducted research on the damage caused by the atomic bomb in September and October 1945. Still photographs were taken by Japanese photographers like Shunichi Kikuchi and also Shigeru Hayashi, and they in fact compiled thousands of photographs, which were then sent back to the States in a tumble dryer and stored in the Library of Congress, among other places. So there was some resistance to negatives being taken as well, and some Japanese photographers stuck up quite a good opposition and said that the negatives that were shot by the photographers were as important to the Japanese as the weapons had been to the Americans. But apart from secretly hiding negatives, basically that and also Japanese homemade film of the damage made in the autumn of 1945 were taken by the occupying forces. And in fact, the suppression of the information created a kind of strange mythology. So actually, there were reports by the Mainichi newspaper in February 1946 saying that actually, as long as you were over 3 kilometres outside explosion-affected zone, the effects of radiation were actually quite positive, and there have been reports of cures of various diseases. So, and this sort of fed into, there was an important narrative about the surrender, the Japanese surrender, and that's really outside the scope of this talk, but it's a very, very interesting and contested area about the reasons for the Japanese surrender. The Emperor talked about it in his Shattered Jewels, which is saving civilization, because of the use of this new type of bomb. But that, in a way, maybe has come to be seen, especially in recent research in the last 40 years, as being a sort of convenient untruth. There were many more reasons for the Japanese surrender, including the Soviet entry into the war. When writers, obviously writers and artists, did start to speak out in 1946, and one of them, Hara Tamiki, who's very famous, he wrote a book called City of Corpses, and in that book he describes how he was visited by an American officer who said to him, "I want you to forget about your memories of the atomic bomb. We won't use it again, so I want you to forget the events of Hiroshima." And Tamiki shot back, "I want to forget, but I'm a writer, and forgetting and writing are different. A writer writes about even things that are long past and forgotten. So in that sense, I can't promise to forget." So a beautiful kind of very eloquent response. And there was another poet, Shoga Shinoe, who wrote a book called Zange, Repentance. She was the daughter of an industrialist, so she felt personally that her family had been personally involved in the Japanese militarization. And she had to have her book mimeographed by a clerk in the prison in Hiroshima. So that sort of, the lengths to which people went were quite extreme. And meanwhile, on the official level, really the idea of giving up, the idea of not giving up, but it can't be helped, the idea of shitakanai, shitakanai. You can't, this is a situation, this is sort of pure Lambertist attitude to describe the state of the injured as victims, really. So that was then, the fact that the Allied forces were actually promoting the bomb, they were promoting the benefits of atomic energy at the time, in the late 40s and the early 50s, was actually seized on by the officials in Hiroshima, because they said, okay, so this atomic energy, this is a way in which we can present the story of Hiroshima in a positive light. So they actually called the bomb, there was a tourist guide published in 1949 called Living Hiroshima, and it described the bomb as the bright flash of peace. And one of the writers of it said that there were no people left alive who remembered the bomb particularly, and that this was now a new city, a new living city. So that also, it sort of, it meant that there was a narrative that also suited the authorities in Tokyo, for whom Hiroshima could not be treated as a special case. The whole of Japan had been destroyed by the war. They had, 66 or more cities had been firebombed, and so the idea that Hiroshima and Nagasaki should have any special case, special pleading, was harshly resisted. And it was really only when much later on that the narrative of the hibakusha started to come out. It was 10 years afterwards, actually, because the extremities to which the hibakusha had been subjected, the kind of outside normal experience aspect of their even within wartime experiences, most people couldn't comprehend, and a lot of people refused to believe them, actually. So no matter how many times the stories of radiation sicknesses and deaths, or, there was a sort of fatigue, there was a sort of what we'd call a sort of compassion fatigue. And Alta Yoko, who was another wonderful, wonderful writer born in Hiroshima, she wrote a lot about the bomb afterwards, and she said it was as though each of us had for a time done everything possible without knowing for sure what exactly it was we were doing. Then we awoke, and now we wish to speak no more. Hiroshima did not somehow resemble a city destroyed by war, but rather a fragment of a world that was ending. Mankind had destroyed itself, and the survivors now felt as though they were suicides who had failed. Yet thus the expression of wanting nothing more came to be seen in their faces. So it wasn't really until there was an anti-nuclear movement in the 1950s, until there was started to be nuclear testing in the Pacific, and one of the Japanese boats that go all over the Pacific looking for fish had been affected, and so this boat is known as Fukumaru, and it was inside the Bikini Atoll testing zone, and it was affected by the fallout. And at that point, then there was a petition. There was a series of women's organisations started off in Tokyo, who started to petition and campaign against the use of atomic energy, the testing of atomic bombs. And at that point, the mayor of Hiroshima was Shinzo Hamada. Shinzo Hamada was himself a hibakusha. And he said, only those who experience the misery of the bomb can truly see the need for peace and the need to save mankind from extinction. So, for the first time, there was a conference in 1955 which gathered the hibakusha together to talk about their experiences. And instead of being these sort of potential suicide victims that Alta Yoko described, and all being angry and confused, at last the hibakusha started to be seen as sort of proud symbols of a movement, and it gave them a sort of authority for the first time. And this first meeting was a great success, and they issued a declaration to the nuclear testers. At that time, it was the United States and the USSR. By having nuclear tests, you are adding to our misery. And it stated that the meeting was organised to come together with 300,000 souls to act in concert to stop the US and the USSR from conducting nuclear tests. So that's the Hiroshima estimate of the affected from the bomb. There are many different estimates, but that is the on-the-ground estimate of the number of people affected by the first atomic bomb. From 1955, the hibakusha declared themselves openly, and they started to travel. And one of them was called Reverend Tanimoto, and if you read John Hersey's Hiroshima, you will find him in there. He was the first man who went to the States, and he started to raise money in order to create what is now the Hiroshima Peaceful Memorial Museum. And he went with the help of American Quakers, which is Barbara Reynolds and Albert Macmillan, and he not only raised money for the museum, but he also got someone called Norman Cousins, who was a famous literary editor of the Saturday Literary Review, interested. And Norman Cousins had already seen the publication of Hersey's book Hiroshima into print. So they started to bring people from Hiroshima over to the States. They even got some of the women who had been facially disfigured to have plastic surgery, and some of the victims started to appear on American TV in sort of quite controversial programs. But the idea was that we must, we have a moral duty to help the survivors. That was the shift that started to be seen in the US. In the 1960s, the victims, the survivors, still had a high profile, and they were very active in the peace movement. And the Holocaust survivors actually started to adopt the hibakusha as a kind of way of making their own stories important. Because at the time, the stories of the camps from the Holocaust hadn't really been widely talked about either, in a kind of parallel, sort of different kind of silencing. And so they saw the movement against atomic weapons as a real opportunity for them to say, look, just as the hibakusha experiences are important, our experiences are vital. And Elie Wiesel campaigned against the Vietnam War, and he described My Lai in terms of Hiroshima. And so Hiroshima started to gain a global meaning, it was on the global memory map for the first time. But at the same time at home, the division in the peace movement had started to create tension and also conflict around the peace memorial ceremonies. So, and in fact, the peace memorial ceremony has at various times been co-opted for political purposes. In 1947, the Australian RAF commander did a fly past over the ceremony, and then in the 1960s, the newly created Japan Self-Defense Force did a march past as well. So, one of the issues that the discussing this in terms of the Holocaust, in terms of the wider question of man's inhumanity to man, in terms of human rights and so on, has meant that the stories in hibakusha can start to have a meaning that is beyond the specific cultural context in which they are created. So one of the people who was most important in that process is Robert J. Lifton. He was a military psychiatrist working for the US in the 50s and 60s. And he went to Hiroshima in 1962. At that point there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think he was very concerned. And he started to interview the hibakusha and in terms of what he called, in terms of trauma, basically. So I'm not taking a kind of purely psychological approach in my thesis, but Freud is important in the sense that he was the first person who dealt with people who had been shell-shocked after the First World War. He actually went to actually sort of engage with them and to use psychological means as a way of seeing if there was something that could be of help. And Robert Lifton came to Hiroshima and he discussed the hibakusha in the same way. What's interesting is that actually the later classification of PTSD, which is now a medically recognised condition, was based on Lifton's research, which had started in the 60s. So he then used the research in Hiroshima to then go out to Vietnam and then also to talk about the survivors, the Holocaust survivors in America. So the studies of trauma, however, are not necessarily completely accepted or used by the hibakusha themselves, unless they have that specific vocabulary. And one psychiatrist I interviewed who is from Hiroshima, she's the second generation hibakusha, said there must have been PTSD symptoms after the bombing, but the Japanese psychological approach doesn't match the Western concept of PTSD. So that's one aspect that I'm interested in exploring more, is the cultural conception of these stories. So yes, in the 1970s, there had been a sort of a dying down of the peace movement, really, and it was found that even though there had been lots of publications by then, most of them were out of print. And Nagaoka Hiroyoshi, who then became an expert on the atomic bomb, found that most of the publications were out of print by that time. And it was really only when more writers, such as Keiji Nakazawa, who was the author of Barefoot Gem, which became a huge success, not just in Japan but around the world. It's translated into over 100 languages. And his work gained wider acceptance. He basically tells a cartoon story of a young boy who survives the atomic bomb. It's a kind of a very engaging, kind of hero, boy hero story that can be understood by anyone. And another writer called, who I hope you might have heard of called Masuji Yukuse, who wrote about the experience of a survivor family in a novel called Black Rain, which is really seen as a sort of classic of fiction in any case, because it sort of untangles the idea of a classic romantic Japanese novel in the light of the Hiroshima bomb. So, if there was any question about it being difficult to talk about your experience as a Japanese hibakusha, it was even more difficult to talk about your experience as a Korean hibakusha. So most Koreans, around 1 million Koreans have been yes, I mean there's a discussion about it, but essentially about 1 million were taken as forced labour from Korea to Japan in 1939. And there were about 30,000 of them in Hiroshima at the time. So there were a huge number of hibakusha from Hiroshima. And it was only really in 1970, at the Peace Memorial Ceremony, that the mayor said, at last, we put the Korean hibakusha at our heart, and he laid a wreath for the first time in memory of the Korean hibakusha, which was a significant leap forward from the kinds of discussions that happened in the 60s about how the Korean hibakusha were too noisy, they said we won't keep them quiet, and so on. And they then finally got a monument erected, only actually in the 1990s, which was a beautiful Korean-made monument of a turtle which faces west, and that towards home. And that then meant that the Korean story was put at the heart of the Peace Memorial Museum as well. So, how then do these stories sort of sit in the kind of the sort of overall way that oral history is conducted? And I think that for me, one of the key points about why and how I've been able to do this research is this idea of resilience theory. So, overcoming extreme conditions is a significant aspect of the hibakusha. It can be broadly described as a phenomenon of positive adjustment in the face of adversity. I think that that's really, really key for the generation that I've talked to, because they were children. They were all between the ages of 5 and the oldest I interviewed was, I think, 15 at the time of writing. So they wouldn't necessarily have identified themselves as hibakusha or survivors, particularly earlier in life. It was what they knew. So their narratives of survival and of witnessing have emerged later, and only at an age and a stage when society lends moral authority to the experience of survival, as is the case with survivors of the Holocaust. Several interviewees told me that although they found it really difficult to come and talk to me because of either health or family, or so many of them are incredibly busy. They spend their lives going into schools, travelling around the country, being what's known as shogencha in Japanese, storytellers, and that's an actually official title. It is a status and a position that you apply for within Hiroshima, which then allows you to speak officially about this experience. So even though they found it very, very difficult to come and talk to me, they found the way in which I was conducting interviews, which was I was conducting interviews over a period of time. So that meant that there would be stops. I could come back to if there was something that they'd forgotten, they could come back later and fill it in. Equally, if I found there was something that was conflicting with something someone else had told me, or the way they told their stories, I could come back and talk to them. So it meant that through the question and answer and the back and forth manner of the interview process, a sort of freestyle process of interviewing, they found that as quite new. They had all been interviewed before by journalists or by their family members, but the ones that I spoke to. But they found this way of interviewing as particularly conducive. So I would say that constructing the narrative was a bit like constructing a work of detective fiction. So we see the tragedy unfolding, and the question that fascinates us is, how did the protagonists manage to survive? How did they manage to create these resilient lives themselves? And one psychologist really helped me as well, a guy called Boris Simon, who said that for those who've experienced a desolate childhood, writing or speaking is a way of giving shape to words that cannot be spoken and of leaving a narrative trace in the outside world. Speaking or writing is the memory of their death and an assertion of their life. So these, I would say the works are works of imagination and memory. It was Viktor Frankl who talked about his own process of coming alive again after his experience in the camps in the Holocaust. And he says that it was as though he had a second life. I know that on that day, in that hour, my new life started. Step for step, I progressed until I became a human being again. The quote assumes that being a victim of experiencing a disaster is, in a sense, puts one outside the human category, and it is the work of the imagination and memory and storytelling to rejoin the human community. So the literature of transformation underlies all hibakusha literature, and I will argue that this aspect is a much richer, more powerful way in which to tell the story, the many stories of the city, for the successors of the hibakusha of Hiroshima. Thank you very much for listening, and I want to show you a very, very brief clip, if you, as they say in Japan, if you have time. So, So this is in a completely different context. So this is an interview that I did to be filmed, basically. So it doesn't really give you an idea of the actual work, the actual way I was interviewing, but it does give you an idea of the urgency that that these survivors feel. Emiko Yamanaka, again, she was giving her experience. She didn't want to. She didn't want to particularly. She was in between operations. She was just about to go back into another hospital, and but she came to the UK actually with her daughter to talk to various groups, and this was one of them, and this was done in a community centre in London.
本当にマスコミとかテレビいろんなもので多くの方たちに訴えてデモすることも大事だけども、本当に大切なことは1対1の対話から真心込めて被爆者はこんな思いをしているんですよ、こんなんですよとコミュニケーションを取りながら語っていく。これ以外に核廃絶はないんじゃないかなって感じております。本当は私は被爆体験を語ったりよそに行くのはあまり好きではないんです。語っているとその時を思い出して胸が苦しくてもう嫌だって語りたくなかったけど、本当にデモをやったりいろんなことをやりながらも核廃絶を訴えても1対1の対話からしか これはできない、微力であっても力がなくっても語っていくところに一人一人語っていって、いずれは一派が万派を呼ぶようなその礎になれたら嬉しいなと。実は私6年前に甲状腺がんで甲状腺取りました。そしてこの首の筋も取りました、がんで。そしてリンパ節も削り、そして胸にドリルで穴を開けてチューブを突っ込んでおりました、リンパ液を取るための。その後、去年脳腫瘍が分かりました。今去年は3センチぐらいだったのが、ここ前頭葉、今は3センチ4ミリくらいになっているので、もう限界だから手術をします。カテーテルでは取れないので。これも10月です。帰ってすぐだったら、命ある限り私の使命は何なの。被爆者でお友達とかいろんなものが皆亡くなりました。ほとんどの方が今こうして生かされていることが、このことを語っていくならば、帰ってゆっくり手術をしても今命ある時に語ろうと勇気を持ってきました。未来の子どもたちに、孫たちに青いお空と緑の大地を残してやりたい。戦争は勝っても負けても不幸です。人類破滅、地球滅亡の核は絶対に使ってはいけないことを語っていくのが私の残された使命、生かされた私のやるべき責任じゃないかと思っております。
I can send you, I mean, there's a sort of extra, I can sort of put together some links to send to Martin, and you can do some more research. There's a lot that you can do online about this as well. So I really encourage you, at least here perhaps, to investigate some of these stories. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. It's very interesting hearing the chronology of it all and sort of thinking about how those of us who study Japan, how we fit into this at some level. Certainly studying Japan in the 80s and 90s, it was considered fairly normal for us as undergraduate students even to go to Hiroshima and meet and talk to hibakusha at some length. Whereas clearly prior to that it wouldn't have happened, and now for our students it's getting increasingly hard for it to happen because there's just so few hibakusha left, and which I think points to why these sort of activities and research like yours is particularly important. There are many things I could ask questions about and so on, but I'm going to open it up the floor and give others the opportunity to come in and ask questions first. Don't be shy.
Hi, hello. I'm a historian of France. I'm very interested, in fact, in the Holocaust, its transmissions via generations. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the notion of transgenerational transmission, the children and grandchildren, how they are part of this, maybe if they're relaying these experiences. So what's their role in terms of the transmission of the life stories that you've been talking about?
Yeah, so they have an important role, and it's actually more and more that's what's talked about in Japan, is transmission. And I think that clearly in Hiroshima, one of the aspects of Hiroshima that is, in my view, very successful, and I don't know if it will be taken up more properly by the Japanese education system, but the Hiroshima education system is extremely thorough about the war, and they still have what is known as a peace education system. So, unlike the rest of Japan, in which the story of the end of the war is consigned to 2 lines in the textbook, In Hiroshima, you have to study, you know, what was going on, and why the atomic bomb was dropped, and all the issues around it. And many times you will have a hibakusha come and talk to you in the school, and also all kids are invited. I don't think they have to, but they mostly do come back to school on the 6th of August, and they usually perform a play or music, or there is some kind of dramatisation of the experience. And I have spoken to people who grew up in that system and who live now outside Hiroshima, but who come back to their old schools because they feel such a connection, and who are really worried about what's going to happen in the next generation, and there won't be first generation to remember. But I think that in terms of the younger generation, they're very motivated, very active younger generation. You met a lot of people who want to study abroad, want to study international relations, who, I mean, it's still a struggle in Japan, but I think that, I have a feeling that that something very positive has come out of the hibakusha being so active, and not, in recent times, not sort of just accepting the official line. So it remains to be seen, I think. I think that people still, I think if there are hibakusha who experience the bomb still around, I think they get, there is a sort of special status that they have, and people don't want them to feel ignored as well, but the whole question about transmission, the museum's being redone, it's being done slightly differently, but more focus on the narratives of the hibakusha and less on the development of the atomic bomb. So,
if I could just follow up on some of this, as Elizabeth was saying, in the school textbooks across Japan, the war is a very, very small part. If you look at the history textbooks, what is interesting, if you look at the English textbooks, there you tend to get a whole chapter about Hiroshima. So the children learn how to talk about Hiroshima in English, but it's taken out of context. And so one of the problems this has led to, in the view of many people, is that you had generations of Japanese growing up as the victim of the war. Look at us, we were bombed by the atomic bomb, without actually any real discussion about what led to the dropping of the bomb, which has been somewhat problematic at times. One of the things I wanted to ask about, though, obviously, not many hibakusha used to speak out about this, but the Japanese are known for often writing diaries. To what degree has there been publication of diaries, particularly following the death of hibakusha, where they might have written down and reflected upon their experiences?
Hibakuniki. They're known as hibakuniki, and they are that was really when in the time of the censorship, that was really where there was. Essentially, there were sort of privately published diaries of people's. So, and there are some wonderful ones, especially by doctors. There's a guy called Hachiya, who kept a diary from, I think, the very day of the bomb throughout the months that followed. And they are very, very extremely vivid accounts, and it's really on the basis of those diaries that you then get those fictional accounts are based. So Massachusetts would have researched all of that work and used that as the basis for those movies. So they're less common now, but they definitely were in the early years.
How great a percentage of the hibakusha taken from that going around the country or going to schools and various different places in telling the story? And has the same thing happened in Nagasaki?
Yes, and it's just the way that things. I just haven't researched in Nagasaki for various reasons, and yes, absolutely. Nagasaki, people travel from Nagasaki all over the world. They'll be there next week. There's the nuclear non-proliferation conference in New York. There'll be people speaking from Nagasaki and Hiroshima there. So I think they're trying to travel as much as possible at the moment.
how great a percentage is it of the population? Is it sort of, are they almost, do they feel the duty to, or they as it were, almost lent on them after a while to do this?
I don't know, it's difficult. I think it's a combination, but I think it's quite self-motivated now, especially. I think maybe in the past, maybe they felt resistant, but with good health, if they're survivors, if they live into their late years, I think they do feel the kind of duty, I would say, because if not then, who? That's what one, in fact, that's what one survivor said to me. He said he's made a film, a reconstruction of Hiroshima in film, and he'll be showing that next week. So it's the reconstruction of the entire city as it looked before 1945, and he's done it over 17 years.
I don't want to go into too many other areas, but have they become vocal in their alarm at the safety, inverted commas, or otherwise, of Japanese nuclear plants? And have they expressed any concern over the change in the Japanese constitution, allowing for? Have they spoken out on these areas?
Yeah, I think that's one of the key. They are very. I think they probably more than anyone are very, very aware of the way that Japanese politics shifts, and they. I asked some specifically. I did ask some specific questions about Article 9, which in Japan they have what's called a peace constitution. So Article 9 states that Japan will not pursue aggressive military policy, and it will only use military for self-defense. And that is a policy which the current Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is seriously trying to change. And he actually is trying to turn the clock back really quite seriously. I don't think he feels any shame in doing so, and that's of huge concern, I think, to the hibakusha. Yeah. So the trouble is, though, that there are few of them, and they speak individually. They speak as individuals, really. There are some atomic suffers associations, but they aren't very powerful within the Japanese government lobbying. But there are fewer of them, they're dying out. So what they really need is the third generation, not the second generation, the third generation to push their case.
They haven't tried to rely with others to increase their influence in these sort of matters.
Well, yeah, they are linking up with, they link up internationally with nuclear test victims as well. And there's been a huge movement recently called the Humanitarian Consequences of Nuclear Weapons, which is a sort of a very interesting revival of the idea of introducing a ban. So 155 countries are seeking a way to do that. And so the hibakusha are extremely loud in that movement, along with people from the Marshall Islands, people from the Christmas Islands, the UK, shamefully conducting nuclear tests as well, and the Nevada sites, the other places, and Kazakhstan, the other places around the world where nuclear tests were conducted. Over 1,000 bombs were dropped over the Nevada desert. So I think they see the route as being international, to be honest. I don't think that they see that their voice is going to be, their particular voice is going to be heard more powerfully than in Japan, because there are so many issues about discrimination and stigma and so on. The issue about compensation hasn't gone away. Some of them are still not acknowledged to receive government compensation. If they experienced black rain, so there are 4 types of hibakusha: those who were in the city where the bomb dropped, those who came into the city within 2 weeks, those who were in utero, so those who were unborn in their mother's wombs, and those who experienced the black rain, which fell over a much wider area than has ever officially been acknowledged. And when I was at the Peace Memorial Ceremony in 2013, Shinzo Abe said, we will pay the Black Rain victims a little bit more. And there were a couple of sort of rather tired and angry shouts from the crowd. It was sort of too late. So I think that the way that the internet is, that they see that their role as international role, I think. That's very clear. You've been to Hiroshima.
Yeah, many times.
And it feels like that. So I don't know what you think, but it has a sense of reaching out in society.
Yeah, I think part of it sometimes is the impressions you take with it, the sort of baggage you take and the expectations of it. And one of the things which I think is most interesting is how the Peace Museum itself just keeps on reinventing itself every 10, 20 years or so. I mean, I first went in 1990, I think it was. And the museum which I visited when I went back last year or the year before, it was barely recognisable. I mean, the outside shell is still the ugly building it always has been, but inside, so many of the displays have been changed. And it'd be interesting to see, when we said they're changed again, it'd be interesting to see what they do this time. And there's some very interesting articles for those who are interested written about the history of why these narratives have changed and so on. But I think probably this is something we've seen worldwide in the way the Imperial Museum in London, I think, has changed the way it does some displays as well, so it may not be unique.
Yeah.
I mean, relating to some of these questions, I think part of the problem for the hibakusha in terms of their influence at the national level is sometimes their message is unbelievably predictable. Before they even start talking, you know what they're going to say. They're going to say, we suffered, no one should suffer like this again, let's get rid of nuclear weapons. And that takes away some of their power at one level, because they're not bringing anything additional to the debate. But there's certainly influence there, and we even saw that in this country when the Japanese embassy was made, the BBC tried to get the BBC to apologise for a segment within the QI comedy quiz programme where they did a segment about Hiroshima, and I protested to the Japanese embassy about their Japanese protesting. We had a very interesting conversation about the politics of what was going on behind the scenes related to that. And you can just see that the influence is there here and there, but it is very predictable at times. And I think what happens in the next stage is sort of the relay batting touch from one generation to the next. How they take it forward is actually going to be very significant now, particularly given the debates what's happening with the Constitution and so on.
Just nuclear energy, you would have thought that there would have been far more condemnation within Japan for what happened, there doesn't seem to be.
No, I mean the timing is significant because, I mean, when the hibakusha were first really able to commemorate and come out, as Elizabeth was saying, so it was 1955, that was almost exactly the same time. I think it was 1954 when the then science agency director, who went on to become a prime minister in the 1980s, announced that Japan should have nuclear power, and the first power station to be built under that directive was the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station, which obviously caused the problems in 2011. The links are always going to be there to some degree between Hiroshima and the atomic
and I think they
power
feel
stations.
that because the hibakusha were very directly involved in that fight about the atomic, they resisted the idea of atomic power more forcibly than in other cities. And in fact, the nuclear reactor that they wanted to build a nuclear reactor in the middle of Hiroshima. And they realised that wasn't possibly going to go down. So they moved it to Shimane Prefecture, and it is built there. But when I went in 2012, just it was a year after the Fukushima, and they felt very betrayed because they had seen all that, and they just said we've been sold and not been taken love, So I think that they do influence. They talk to the survivors of Fukushima, give them advice how to claim compensation. They're working behind the scenes with them on that level.
Obviously the third generation is the one kind of in power right now, but how about the second generation? Is there much activism or anything happening with those groups?
Well, the thing is, the kind of the second generation, it's difficult. It's difficult about the second generation because on one level, this is a first generation in the sense that they directly experience the atomic bomb, but obviously their parents and grandparents were the real first generation. So it's now, it's now at least 5 generations maybe have experienced this, but the sons and daughters of people who were directly affected by the explosion, in general, don't want to talk about it, to be honest. That was my experience anyway. They're not very politically active. I think the idea is, you get on with your life. And I was in meetings where a 94-year-old woman got up and she said, I am a hibakusha. She had been to that community meeting very frequently, and she never let on that she was a hibakusha. But presumably, a lot of the other people in the room were related to Russia or whatever, but they weren't talking about it. But then after, but it's changing, so now, I think the idea of setting your life on an even keel, and also I think that simply the idea of, such a big burden really of care, looking after Russia, and I don't think that it's really something that people want to go into a lot in their normal everyday life.
If I can relate to that, and I've got friends from Hiroshima, and when I sort of found out they're from Hiroshima, you start sort of saying, they can almost tell from your reaction what the next question is, and they're just sort of saying, don't even go there.
Yes.
If it's a city of 1 million people, it's a normal city. Something happened, but that's history. Our lives and my identity should not be shaped by what happened in 1945. I was born in 1970 something or other. Don't even start talking about bomb, it's not relevant to me.
Yeah,
and I think that's even more the case, coming back to another question, in Nagasaki, where the bomb missed the target area by about 3 or 4 miles anyway, and Nagasaki's got a very different history because of its connections to China and the Netherlands and so on. And so although the bomb has still got its significance, just visiting the city, it doesn't hit you in the face. You almost have to go out of your way to find the bits to do with it. Whereas Hiroshima, even at the main station, you've got the signs for the A-bomb dome and all the rest of it. So it's a very different setup in that respect.
And also, I think because it was taken up as an official level in 1947, when they said, we want to make this a city of peace. So there was a very conscious decision to make the experience of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima absolutely central. And that's why, in a way, it has gained more attention and also possibly funding as a result of that. So Nagasaki has sort of not given itself that, it hasn't consciously made itself, given itself that identity. It's sort of followed on from Hiroshima, but it wasn't an immediate self-identification.
When I went to Hiroshima in 1990 to the Peace Museum, there was actually signs on the wall talking about don't let any other city after Hiroshima ever be bombed again with an atomic bomb. And it's just like, it happened 3 days later. You're not mentioning that at all. And there's basically, certainly when I went there in 1990, it was very difficult to come across any mention of Nagasaki at all. I wasn't particularly looking out for it when I went there most recently, but it is a very different setup. The museum in Nagasaki is so much smaller as well. It's more like a house.
I think that they are different cases, but I think that they do all meet in these discussions about testimonies and about survivors. And I think that I think the main issue really is the history or what happened after the war and the occupation. It meant that the struggle to sort of really put this at the forefront of national politics. That was what's true. It could have been. I think it could have been, but in the way that Japanese politics is essentially as a client state of America, it's very, very difficult for that to be at the centre of national politics.
Questions?
Has there been any talk of how it's going to be continued after the hibakusha have passed on?
I was trying to talk about that a little bit. I think that if you look, I was sent some links through. There's some interesting discussions about that on NHK. And the last year, there was NHK actually broadcast the entire day of August the 6th. They broadcast the entire ceremony and then all the events and activities afterwards. And they spent the whole day interviewing people and including a lot of discussion about transmission in the younger generation. I've also interviewed Basha who have been with their children, with their grandchildren, have been to give their experience at the UN. So I think that intergenerational work is really, really valuable, really, really valuable in this area. And if I could do an extra project, that's what I would do. I'd go back and talk to the try and do an intergenerational oral history project with 3 generations.
And one of the things that's interesting is also how the memory of Hiroshima and how it's done is starting to influence in other areas. So for the JAL Flight 123 crash, which I've researched, crash in 1985, the families of victims from that in the past few years have been going down to Hiroshima to talk to the Peace Museum and find out how they've done things, to think about how the JAL crash should be remembered in terms of a type of museum, and recording interviews with relevant people so those documents are available for the next generation. And I dare say those two groups then will, in particular the Hiroshima one, will go on to influence to some degree the memorialisation which will go on with the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake. Kobe, I think, is a little bit different in the way it's handled things, but I think the Hiroshima influence is going to continue, and we'll start to see almost like a little template developing maybe of how things will be done.
That's right, and I think that in that sense, I think in a way, I think it's a great, in a way, what the city has done with the survivors as well is a great model, because. Although most of the people in Hiroshima were not in the bomb. They don't have families in the bomb either, because so many people were killed. Obviously, the people who actually came into the city don't have any family connection necessarily. They came and lived in the city when it was being reconstructed. A lot of them were demobilised soldiers who came back from the war. Hiroshima was a port. They were offloaded. The whole of Japan was destroyed, and why not stay in Hiroshima as good as anywhere else, So this whole idea that everybody in Hiroshima has a memory of the bomb, you can't, or has a generation memory, you can't assume that. But the people who do have that connection have had a major impact on the system and have been in positions of influence and
Any further questions? Okay, just as we start wrapping things up, just as a reminder, we'll be sending out more sort of details about it in due course. As I said, in about the second week of November, we're going to be doing a range of things related to sort of the 70th anniversary of Hiroshima. The Peace Museum itself is sending over posters and various materials which we'll be displaying around the school. We'll be showing the film Kuroi Ame Black Rain, the proper one, not the Michael Douglas. One evening as well, and having some more seminars and stuff related to it as well, so hopefully some of you will be able to attend that. But for Dave, if you could join me once again in thanking Elizabeth for coming along and giving a wonderful talk.